Over poetry. Over poetry.
You know, I've often said that every poem solves something for me in life.
Hello.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Over Poetry Podcast Edition.
I'm Micah, poetry PhD, general shenanigans, also a teacher.
And I'm Thew. I have an MFA. I teach poetry and wear flowers in my beard. Life's great.
Yep, can't complain. Each episode will bring 2 public domain poems to enjoy live before your very eyes, or in this case, ears. This week we're focusing on the work of Letitia Elizabeth Landon.
Letitia Elizabeth Landon. Now, this is a new one for me. I have not heard of this poet before, but a few poets that I do admire have fanned over her,
Definitely
right?
fangirled over her. I feel like modern readers don't respect her as much as they should, because she's arguably more famous for the poems that people wrote about her than she is for the poems she wrote herself.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so Christina Rossetti, who was the sister of Dante Rossetti, who was one of the pre-Raphaelites. Anyway, she wrote a poem about Letitia Elizabeth Landon. Also, Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a poem about Letitia Elizabeth Landon. But I think Landon deserves to be remembered in her own right, not just as a subject being written about, but because, her poetry, it is memorable, and she was working within constraints that I feel like, again, the modern reader doesn't really understand. And it was incredibly popular in its day.
Constraints. What do you mean? What constraints was she working in?
Well, she felt like she had to fit this stereotype of the Victorian poetess, meaning, she had to write about, domestic topics like love, which, not that that's bad. She wrote excellent poetry. But I think there was sort of it was a diminutive term to be called the poetess.
I hate that. I hate it when people assign female affixes to things and then are like, that's a lesser version.
Yeah. She did kind of fit the stereotype. A lot of her poetry is very flowery. It feels very Victorian. It's about life and love and the domestic sphere. But there's a lot of deep stuff in there too. It's not all just love and flowers. And if it were just about love and flowers, that doesn't mean it's bad.
Right.
It's just different style. But there's a lot hidden in there, but I feel like people don't look for it.
So when I was doing a little bit of research on her, as I was looking at some of her poems, again, this is the first time I've ever heard about her. I got the sense that she wrote as a sort of way to support herself financially.
Very much.
She was very prolific because she had to be.
Right.
She didn't have time to labor over her poems for 10 years like Horace tries to get everyone to do. She had to pump it out and get her dues for it so that she could keep living and getting what she needed.
Well, she's definitely in the Edgar Allan Poe school of poetry, meaning she's trying to make a living off of this, and she's supporting her family off of this. And actually, Edgar Allan Poe did admire her work.
Really?
Yeah, he did.
That's saying something, because he did not admire a lot of people's work. I guess he was very skeptical of people like Emerson. But Letitia was she in the UK?
She was. She was actually born in London, in Chelsea specifically. And she came from a fairly well-to-do family. But then her father made some bad investments, and so they lost all their money. And she'd lived a pretty nice life, and then that all changed. So they moved out of Chelsea into Brompton, and she was living in a relatively secluded area. And that's when creative writing became a means to support not just herself, but her family. And this is also where another controversial element enters into a biography.
Ooh, do tell.
And depending on which source you look at, they're going to say very different things. So one of the sources I looked at, which is just an encyclopedia entry, they were like, One of Landon's neighbors was William Jordan, editor of the Weekly Literary Gazette, who agreed to publish one of Landon's poems, which appeared under the pen name L. It wasn't until I looked at several other articles, finally landing on this one from The Spectator, that they tell the full story. Her married publisher, William Jordan, not only encouraged her to write more and better poems, he also groomed her and then impregnated her with 3 children. Although these births were covered up, the fact that for many years Landon and Jordan were lovers appeared to have been an open secret in literary London.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
But again, depending on which source you look at, they don't mention that. So.
Okay.
I think her, like, after she passed away, I think her friends were like, we're not going to talk about that, you know. But that is a reason why her poetry got famous. Also, she happened to be family friends with Sarah Siddons, who was like the Zendaya of her era. Sarah Siddons was an extremely popular actress.
Okay.
Her admirers of Siddons were widely mocked for their fan hysteria. Anyway.
I just want to say that, like, that sucks that happened to Elle. Like,
yeah. About
like,
Jordans.
Yeah, just like people in power being predatory on other people, like upon younger people. Like, that's...
It was complicated because, like, she got famous off of it, but also, like, maybe she would have been famous anyway, even without his help. Like, who's to say? Do you think the scandal followed her all her life? Like, later she was gonna get engaged to William Forster, who was Charles Dickens's, like, BFF and biographer.
Mm-hmm.
And that ended up, like, scandals and rumors that had sort of been percolating since her Jordan's affair sort of broke them up. And it just goes to show, like, a woman of that period, like, your reputation was everything. Her reputation was never secure because she was doing, well, one, she was having an affair, which was incredibly risky. Also, she lived alone in a boarding house and, like, was writing to support the family, which was seen as, I think, quite strange. And people were like, that's weird. That is a weird thing to do.
It's just so nauseating to, like, think about Victorian men and them thinking that women are these temptresses. Yeah. Like, even, like, a young, developing person. Like, yeah. As if she should be the one scandalized by that and not him. That's...
I don't know.
Anyways.
Between their mutual influence, her work started to get some attention. Her first collection didn't actually make any money because the publisher was, like, broke. But it did sell well. But she kept going. And again, she was only initially writing under the initials LEL. Mm-hmm. She was kind of working off of, like, the Victorian sexism a little bit. Because she was like, I think she knew that people would be like, is this a woman writing this? Like, she knew that would evoke curiosity.
Sure.
And I think that she used it to her advantage, which I think there's sort of a benevolent sexism in that. Like, people are more surprised when a woman of that era can write poetry well, so they're more likely to pay attention to you, if that makes sense.
Right.
So in a way, she benefited from it. And this is from, like, the Glenna Stevenson article in Victorian Poetry. A woman who wrote was simply unacceptable. If she belonged to me, Charles Lamb, who was like a poet, declared of Landon, I would lock her up and feed her on bread and water till she left off writing poetry. A female poet, or a female author of any kind, ranks below an actress, I think.
What?
Which Charles Lamb was such a meek and mild guy. It's so crazy to me that he said that.
So, like, okay, I'm trying to think of Charles Lamb. I feel like he was an essayist around the time of, like, Wordsworth or something. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that's what I remember from nonfiction classes.
Again, I think, well, everybody's complicated, but it's, like, so wild to me that he said that. But he had a very complicated relationship with women. The article then goes on to say that was not the norm. Like, that was extreme, like, more of an extreme view. Although it was a view. But Glenna Stevens is like, more typical is Francis Jeffrey's much-quoted opening to his essay, women we fear cannot do everything, nor even everything they attempt, but what they can do, they do, for the most part, excellently. Which is so interesting to me. So people assumed, I mean, there was so much hubbub trying to figure out who L.E.L. was, and when it came out who she was, I think people, again, she benefited off of, I think, some benevolent sexism.
Sure.
And people being so shocked that she was actually, oh, woman is talented, oh, how extraordinary, and I think they assumed that her poetic persona was the same person that she was, which isn't true. Like, she was making creative decisions, about how to present herself to the world. She transitioned from writing poetry mostly to writing novels because people were starting to get critical of her poetry. It's really around the switch from the Romantic period to the Victorian period that novels start to take precedence over poetry, which is a transition that is very interesting to me.
I just want to note real quick, you talked about how people were just so impressed that, like, a woman can write poetry, and you said that, like, people assumed that she was the same person as her persona.
Right.
That just reminds me of interviews I've heard with writers of marginalized communities where they feel pigeonholed into writing about their actual experiences, People are so interested in, like, hearing about how they are marginalized by society, and it's like, just let everyone be human and write from their imagination if they want to.
Okay, from the human perspective, like, I get, I would be curious about her lifestyle too. It was unusual for the time. Like, after her father's death, she lived alone in a boarding house. She'd had an affair with Jordan, 3 children, births covered up. It was scandalous for the time. Like, I can imagine myself as a reader being like, oh, that's the dirt I want to hear about,
Sure.
I think that, and that was sort of how Byron built his fame too, was very much about his personal exploits, in addition to his poetic persona. But the two are very much intertwined and married together. So it's nothing new, and it's not something that's just women have to deal with, or just people from a marginalized community have to deal with.
Right.
But does it affect those people more? Probably yes. And again, from the human perspective, I get, like, wanting to know. I would be very curious about what Elizabeth Landon had to say about some things, just because her lifestyle was unusual for the time and the place. But also, I think she did feel constrained by it and pigeonholed, like you said. And she's like, I don't want everybody up in my business, because that's not the only thing that I am, and I'm just writing poetry to try to survive. And not that she didn't take creative pleasure in it, because she did, but
Sure.
It was also about paying the bills. Not just for herself, but for her whole family. And again, this is from, like, the initial article, like the encyclopedia article. It says, weary of facing life without a male protector. Is that an interesting phrase? Landon, in June 1838, entered into an ill-fated marriage with George McLean, sailing with him immediately thereafter to the Gold Coast, Africa, where McLean served as governor of the Cape Coast settlement. She died, and this is another scandal, at Cape Coast on October 15th, 1838, the victim of accidental self-poisoning, or, as some of the evidence surrounding her death suggests, the victim of suicide. We have a bit more information about this. But the Poetry Foundation article says she was frequently ill, which suggests that this was not suicide. This illness had been developing over time. She frequently remarked in her letters that her mental and physical health suffered as a result of overwork. But, so it suggests that her health wasn't great to begin with. But also it definitively says that she died from an overdose of Prussic, which is hydrocyanic acid. And why does any of that matter, whether it was suicide or an overdose or just simply illness? I think because you have to remember, at the time, suicide, there was so much stigma around it. Like, this is from the Oxford Companion to British History. Prior to 1823, which is when a law was passed, the corpses of those found to be suicides were not even buried in traditional cemeteries and were impaled through the heart before burial to prevent ghosts.
Whoa.
So there was... Okay, yes. She died in 1838, not 1823. So it had been a decade. But still, culture doesn't change that quickly. So there was quite a bit of scandal around whether she'd not... Or indeed, if she'd been murdered. Some people suggested that she had been murdered, which there's no evidence to suggest that was true.
I mean, shoot, just as, like, a disconnected person in 2024,
right?
Like, I want to know what happened. Like,
right.
I really hope that her new husband didn't murder her. Like, that would be tragic.
Who knows? This is some chronological snobbery on my part. I'm like, oh,
sure.
They just didn't know how to use medicine back then, which is not true. They did. But as a modern day sort of arrogant person, that's my initial thought, to be like, the poor dear just probably didn't know what she was doing. But there's no evidence to suggest that. I mean, I don't know. Because she'd written some very sad poetry just a little bit before that. Oh. So, this is again from The Spectator. At the height of her fame, L.E.L. was one of the leading stars in a glittering literary firmament. Her portrait was exhibited at the Royal Academy, and Edgar Allan Poe, there we go, thought her genius so self-evident it was almost unnecessary to speak of it. And again, on the ship sailing to Africa, she had written 2 poems that were published in the New Monthly Magazine in January 1839, just as the news of her death reached England. Because, yes, she died in 1838, but it took a few months for the news of her death to reach England. So in one of these poems, in her Night at Sea, there's the line, "My friends, my absent friends, do you think of me as I think of you?" Reiterations of which have acquired special poignancy in light of her death. And there were a lot of people, again, like Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christina Rossetti, who wrote elegies about her. She had fans, people who were really quite devastated by her death. And it's never quite been resolved. No one knows if she was murdered or a suicide or just a tragic accident. Or indeed if she'd just been in such weak health for so long that was just kind of the final straw. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm curious about it because it seems like she has not been a very popular historical figure lately. Like, I'm curious about, like, did her popularity and fame pretty much peter out as soon as she died? Has she had resurgences or anything?
Right. I think because there was so much scandal during her lifetime and that people didn't know how to write a proper biography of her. Because you can imagine the challenge of that for her friends being like, I want to write a decent biography of her so she's remembered, but I don't want to include X, Y, and Z scandal because I don't want to, like, tarnish her memory.
Right.
So you end up leaving out all the stuff that's crucial to tell to her life, and it just becomes a very lopsided portrait of someone that people aren't interested in. Which I always think, if someone ever writes a biography about me, which I don't think will ever happen, but if they do, keep all the scandal in. Just let it all out.
Who's going first?
Why don't you go first? I've been talking for too long.
Okay. All right. As I was telling you before we started recording, I'm a lover of short poems. Like, that's my thing. And so I found this one poem that she wrote called Revenge. I'm not choosing it just because it's short, just to be clear. I'm choosing it because it has some very interesting ideas inside of it. So I'll go ahead and read it. Revenge. I gaze upon her rose-wreathed hair and gaze upon her smile. Seem as you drink the very air her breath perfumed the while. And wake for her the gifted line, that wild and witching lay, and swear your heart is as a shrine that only owns her sway. 'Tis well, I am revenged at last. Mark you that scornful cheek. The eye averted as you passed spoke more than words could speak. I now, by all the bitter tears that I have shed for thee, the racking doubts, the burning fears, avenged they well may be. By the nights passed in sleepless care, the days of endless woe, all that you taught my heart to bear, all that yourself will know. I would not wish to see you laid within an early tomb. I should forget how you betrayed and only weep your doom. But this is fitting punishment, to live and love in vain. O my wrung heart, be thou content and feed upon his pain. Go thou and watch her lightest sigh, thine own it will not be, and bask beneath her sunny eye, it will not turn on thee. 'Tis well, the rack, the chain, the wheel, far better hadst thou proved. E'en I could almost pity feel, for thou art not beloved. There's this one song that's been on the radio for the past few years about wanting their ex-lover to, like, be cheated on like they were, or whatever. It's kind of giving those sorts of vibes. But it's another look at a common theme in poetry of unrequited love.
Right.
But past the pleading stage.
Right.
It is, you have unrequited this, so I want you now to feel unrequited love.
Right.
And in this way, we are seeing from the speaker how hard it is for her to feel this unrequited love, comparing it to so many torture devices.
I kind of like the intensity of that. I mean, I know it's cliched, Well, that's the thing. It seems cliche to me now, but I'm like, yeah, but she was the first one that did it. And there's a way, again, as a modern reader, I'm looking at this, and I'm searching for her biography, and I'm like, oh, I wonder if she was writing this about Jordan's or Forster. And I'm like, yeah, but her persona isn't necessarily her.
Right.
This could just be a fictional person, but I also feel the impulse to try to see her life in her poetry, which I think is natural and human, but also not necessarily fair, because this could be a fictional situation. But it's, universal enough that most people have experienced it. Maybe not exactly this, but something like it. I really like the line, or that slant rhyme at the very end in the last stanza. Beloved and proved.
Oh yeah, that is nice. I did not catch that slant rhyme there. But you're right, that is good.
Dr. Talbot always said, like, in romantic poetry, like, rhyme indicates connection. Didn't he always say that?
I feel like you did, yeah.
So a slant rhyme to me at the end is like, yeah, we're not connected anymore. Screw you.
Yeah, I feel like Dickinson often, will end a poem with some slant rhyme to do with similar things. So I'm a big fan of that technique as well. I really like what you said about it seeming cliche now, but, it could very well have been innovative back then.
Right. Which is it's so hard to judge as a modern reader.
Yeah, it's hard to judge. I don't know. I like it. I feel like it feels very human, and I like that it reverses the trope of unrequited love and really makes it anger-inducing.
Right. I do too.
Also, I don't think that, culturally, women back then were probably allowed to be very angry. I might be wrong on that point, but
I don't know. I think it was the pre-Raphaelite movie. They depicted a lot of angry women. But it's very sexualized anger with the pre-Raphaelites. The angry women always look very sexy when they're being angry. Which I don't think is the point of this poem.
Yeah, definitely not. Let's read your poem.
Okay, I have to preface this because it's kind of confusing. So I was just saying, Letitia Elizabeth Landon, she died young and she had people writing elegies about her. Mm-hmm. This is an elegy that she herself wrote about someone who preceded her in death. Someone named Felicia Hemans, who was arguably one of the cleverest women of the day, or cleverest people, period, not just women. She was a polyglot, she was widely admired. I mean, she had correspondence with Percy Bysshe Shelley, and she actually died in her 40s, so not as young as Letitia Elizabeth Landon, but still a bit premature, I'd be mad if I died at 40.
Yeah, I don't want to die at 40.
Yeah. So, I'm wondering if Letitia Elizabeth Landon saw a bit of herself in... Again, I'm mixing up the persona in the back in her, which I know I shouldn't do, but I do, it's not just me that has said this, multiple people have said, that this elegy for Felicia Hemans feels very much like Letitia Elizabeth Landon writing her own elegy, which would prove prescient, because she herself also ended up dying prematurely. So I shall read. No more, and never more returning, will thy beloved presence gladden earth. No more wilt thou with sad yet anxious yearning cling to those hopes which have no mortal birth. Thou art gone from us, and with thee departed. How many lovely things have vanished too, deep thoughts that at thy will to being started, and feelings teaching us our own were true. Thou hast been round us like a viewless spirit, known only by the music on the air. The leaf or flowers which thou hast named inherit a beauty known but from thy breathing there. For thou didst on them fling thy strong emotion. I love that. Flinging on flowers your strong emotion, that's cool. A beauty known but from thy breathing there, for thou didst on them fling thy strong emotion, the likeness from itself the fond heart gave, as planets from afar look down on ocean and give their own sweet image to the wave. And thou didst bring from foreign lands their treasures, as floats thy various melody along. We know the softness of Italian measures and the grave cadence of Castilian song. A general bond of union is the poet, by its immortal verse is language known, and for the sake of song do others know it, when glorious poet makes the world his own. And thou, how far thy gentle sway extended, the heart's sweet empire over land and sea. Many a stranger and far flowers blended in a soft wreath that glory bound for thee. The echoes of the Susquehanna's waters paused in the pine woods words of thine to hear. And to the wide Atlantic's younger daughters, thy name was lovely and thy song was dear. Was not this purchased all too dearly? Never can fame atone for all that fame has cost. We see the goal, but know not the endeavor, nor what fond hopes have on the way been lost. What do we know of the unquiet pillow, by the worn cheek and tearful eyelid pressed, when thoughts chase thoughts like the tumultuous billow, whose very light and foam reveals unrest? We say the song is sorrowful, but know not what may have left that sorrow in the song. However mournful words may be, they show not the whole extent of wretchedness and wrong. They cannot paint the long sad hours passed only in vain regrets, or what we feel we are. Alas, the kingdom of the lute is lonely, cold is the worship coming from afar. Yet what is mind in woman but revealing, in sweet clear light the hidden world below, by quicker fancies and a keener feeling than those around, the cold and careless knew. What is to feed such feeling, but to culture a soil whence pain will never more depart? The fable of Prometheus and the vulture reveals the poet's and the woman's heart. Unkindly are they judged, unkindly treated, by careless tongues and by ungenerous words, while cruel sneer and hard reproach repeated jar the fine music of the spirit's chords. Wert thou not weary, thou whose soothing numbers gave other lips the joy thine own had not? Didst thou not welcome thankfully the slumbers which closed round thy mourning human lot? What on this earth could answer thy requiring for earnest faith, for love the deep and true, for beautiful which was thy soul's desiring, but only from thyself its being drew? How is the warm and loving heart requited in this harsh world, where it a while must dwell, its best affections wronged, betrayed, and slighted? Such is the doom of those who love too well. Better the weary dove should close its pinion, fold up its golden wings, and be at peace. Enter, O Lady, that serene dominion, where earthly cares and earthly sorrows cease. Fame's troubled hour has cleared, and now replying 1,000 hearts their music ask of thine. Sleep with the light, the lovely and undying, around thy grave, a grave which is a shrine.
I remember her rhyming know it and poet.
Very clever.
Perhaps the first time. I mean, we've got the whole, like, I'm a poet and I didn't know it.
Right.
Very clever rhyme. So maybe she invented that. I don't know. But, like, more substantial than that, I really love how she brought up the myth of Prometheus. Prometheus is a very fascinating mythological character. Like, he's the creator of human life in Greek mythology. He's got foresight, so he can see the future.
And he gets his liver eaten out every day.
Yeah, he tricks Zeus into accepting the worst part of the meat sacrifice, and then Zeus is like, you're gonna be punished for all of time. And I feel like I might be misremembering, but I feel like she was relating that to women in poetry.
And fame in general, I think.
It's just like
Constantly producing something and then having it torn from you.
Right.
Very violently.
Yeah, like that. Wow, like that just sounds terrible and awful. And yet I feel like the sacrifice of Prometheus is really Christian in feel, you know?
Right.
Prometheus is a really weird figure where he's both Christ and Lucifer in a way.
Interesting.
Because he has created life, but also, like, defies the ruling God.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about that before.
So, like, I really like looking at, like, seeing women's poetry in that sort of lens, too. An absolute gift that gets ripped apart. But it's still, like, freely given. What are your thoughts on this poem?
Well, I really like the line, can fame atone for all that fame has cost? Because there's no way I assume Letitia, Elizabeth Landon, is writing about herself and not just Felicia Hemans. Even though this, yes, is an elegy for Felicia Hemans. I think that she's writing also about herself. And again, multiple people have said that, it's not just me. But I think it's as relevant a question now as it was then. I mean, we see... She says the worship coming from afar is cold, which is true. There isn't these parasocial relationships that I feel like have been in the media a lot lately. People talking about these unnatural, arguably, relationships we have with celebrities, which I have many parasocial relationships with celebrities. But it's no substitute for real human connection and real human love. And I think that Letitia Elizabeth Landon had to face the brunt of that. A lot of people being like, oh, your poetry's so great, your poetry's so wonderful. But then in person, I mean, they would never have talked to her because she was a whore.
I want to comment on what you said about the elegy being about Felicia Hemans. I recently read a elegy written by William Cowper, who is in the like sensibilities poet era between like Pope and the Romantics or whatever, Enlightenment and the Romantics. And that elegy is really beautiful. And like at the very like last stanza or two, like he makes it explicitly clear that it is about him, kind of.
Interesting.
Like he writes the elegy and it's like this person who drowns at sea.
Right.
And so it is an elegy about someone who actually died.
Right.
But then it's connected to him. So it's, you know, it's absolutely within the poetic tradition to write an elegy about someone else, but then connect it to yourself.
Interesting. I wonder if maybe she was inspired by that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to know it's impossible to know exactly what her intention was.
Right,
But some of the lines just feel so relevant to her own life.
This has been fun. I feel like the classic canon too often excludes certain poets. Like, and it seems to have a specific prejudice against poets that were popular in their day.
Right.
If they're popular in their day, there's no way their works were worth reading now.
Right. Except for Lord Byron, who somehow gets a pass.
Yeah, but also I still don't think he's as well respected as other Romantic poets still.
That's true.
Like, I think William Wordsworth still, like, trumps Byron in the scholastic mind.
Right.
But I could be wrong.
Speaking of, we've got to have a Lord Byron episode soon.
We do have to have a Lord Byron episode.
And it's going to be long because I've got stuff to say. I'm sure you do too.
Oh, I mean, I don't think I have near as much to say, but I'm very excited to learn because Byron is a fascinating figure. Now, I'm going to give y'all a writing prompt, okay? I invite you to write an elegy about a parasocial relationship you have with a celebrity that died. And it can be a celebrity, or it can be like a artist mentor, but someone who has died in your lifetime that you have looked up to. You do not have to connect it to your own life. Like, that's a little, you know.
You can if you want to, though.
It's a little macabre. You can if you want. Alright, y'all, stay yourselves immersed in the whims of verse, to not fall heretic to the wiles of your prosaic lives. Thank you for joining us at Over Poetry. Have a good night.
Goodbye. Good night.
Bye.